The man had already taken 2 sips of the lemonade before he realized something was wrong. His fingers tightened around the glass. His vision blurred. Across the kitchen table, the woman watching didn't look kind anymore. Because for 10 years, she had been waiting. 10 long years watching the front gate of the house where her husband died. Every morning. Every evening. The same chair by the window. The same quiet street. The same unanswered question. And then one afternoon, the killer unknowingly walked back in. Not as a criminal, but as a buyer. The old woman welcomed him with a gentle smile. And a glass of lemonade. He should never have touched. What no one on Maplewood Lane realized was that Eleanor Whitmore had been practicing this moment for 10 years. Before we get into the rest of this story, I want to know something. Tell me in the comments section where in the world you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel, and how they resonate with people everywhere. And if you enjoy deep storytelling like this, don't forget to hit the like button, and subscribe. Now, let's begin. There are some neighborhoods in America where nothing ever seems to happen. Quiet streets. Identical houses. White picket fences. The kind of place where neighbors know each other by name. And the loudest sound at night is usually the wind moving through the trees. Maplewood Lane was exactly that kind of street. Tucked away on the edge of a quiet suburban town. A place where children rode bicycles in the afternoon. And porch lights turned on like clockwork every evening. For decades, it had been peaceful. Predictable. Safe. And at the end of the street sat a modest 2-story home with pale blue shutters. It belonged to Richard and Eleanor Whitmore. To the neighbors, they were the kind of couple everyone liked. Richard Whitmore was known as the friendly one. The man who waved at every passing car. Who helped neighbors shovel snow during winter. Who never forgot birthdays or neighborhood barbecues. Eleanor was quieter. Polite. Reserved. But always warm. The kind of woman who baked lemon pie for church gatherings. And sent thank you cards for the smallest gestures. They had lived in that house for nearly 30 years. It was where they celebrated holidays. Where they watched their nieces and nephews grow up. Where they believed they would grow old together. But on one night, 10 years ago, that quiet home became the scene of something no one on Maplewood Lane could have imagined. It was late October. A cold wind had begun moving through the town. Leaves scraped along the pavement in restless circles. That night, Richard Whitmore returned home later than usual. Neighbors would later remember seeing his car pull into the driveway around 9:15 p.m. The porch light flickered on. Then the front door closed behind him. And for a while, everything seemed normal. But sometime after 10 p.m., something happened inside that house. Something violent. Something sudden. Something that would leave a question hanging over Maplewood Lane for the next 10 years. According to the police report, Eleanor Whitmore had been upstairs when she heard it. A sound. Not a scream. Not a crash. But something heavier. A struggle. Furniture scraping against hardwood floors. By the time she rushed downstairs, it was already over. Richard Whitmore lay on the living room floor. And the man who killed him was already gone. No broken windows. No forced doors. Just silence. And a house that suddenly felt far too large, and far too empty. When the police arrived, the street filled with flashing red and blue lights. Neighbors stood behind police tape in disbelief. Murders didn't happen here. Not on Maplewood Lane. Not in Richard Whitmore's house. But the strangest part of the investigation wasn't the crime itself. It was the absence of answers. No weapon. No fingerprints. No witnesses. And no obvious reason why anyone would want Richard Whitmore dead. Within weeks, investigators began to suspect something troubling. Whoever committed the murder might have known Richard personally, because there were no signs of forced entry. Which meant one thing. Richard Whitmore had likely opened the door himself. For months, detectives worked the case relentlessly. They interviewed neighbors, friends, co-workers, even distant relatives. But every lead ended the same way. With silence. Richard Whitmore had no enemies. No financial disputes. No criminal history. No hidden secrets anyone could uncover. The town watched closely as investigators searched for answers. But the weeks slowly turned into months. And the months eventually turned into years. The media stopped covering the story. Police resources moved to newer cases. And eventually, the file containing Richard Whitmore's murder was moved to a quiet shelf in the cold case unit. Unsolved. Unanswered. Unfinished. For most people, life slowly returned to normal. But for Eleanor Whitmore, time stopped moving the night her husband died. Because she believed something no one else seemed willing to believe. The man who killed Richard was still out there. And one day, he might come back. In the years that followed, many people expected Eleanor to leave the house. After all, most people couldn't live in a place where something so terrible had happened. But Eleanor never moved. She stayed in the same house. The same bedroom. The same kitchen. And every afternoon, neighbors noticed the same quiet routine. Eleanor would sit beside the front window, looking out toward the gate, watching the street. At first, people thought she was grieving. But after a few years, something about it began to feel different. Because she wasn't just remembering. She was waiting. 10 years is a long time. Long enough for most memories to fade. Long enough for people to move on. But Eleanor Whitmore had spent that decade doing something very few people ever have the patience to do. She replayed the night of her husband's murder, again and again. Every sound. Every detail. Every movement inside the house. There was one moment she could never forget. Something small. Something police dismissed almost immediately. 3 days before Richard died, a man had knocked on their door. He introduced himself as someone interested in buying property nearby. At the time, it seemed harmless. The man said he was exploring houses in the neighborhood, looking for investment opportunities. Richard had chatted with him briefly on the porch. Eleanor remembered watching from inside. She couldn't hear the entire conversation. But she remembered something else. The man's eyes. He wasn't looking at the house. He was studying the doors, the windows, the layout of the property. And when he left, he looked back once more, as if committing everything to memory. At the time, Eleanor thought nothing of it. But 3 days later, Richard Whitmore was dead. When she told the police about the visitor, investigators tracked down dozens of possible buyers and investors. None of them matched the description. Eventually, the lead faded. Just like everything else. Except, Eleanor never forgot his face. Criminal psychologists often talk about a strange pattern. One that many killers share. They return. Sometimes they revisit crime scenes. Sometimes they follow news coverage. And sometimes, they insert themselves back into the story. Not out of guilt, but curiosity. They want to see what happened after. They want to see if they got away with it. For years, Eleanor thought about that. And slowly, a dangerous idea began forming in her mind. If the man who killed Richard had once visited the house pretending to be interested in it, then maybe one day, he might come back again. And if he did, she wanted to be ready. 10 years after the murder, something unusual appeared on Maplewood Lane. A sign, planted carefully in the Whitmore front yard. For sale. Neighbors were surprised. Many assumed Eleanor had finally decided to move on. But there was something strange about the listing. The price was absurd. Far above the market value. So high that no reasonable buyer would ever consider it. Some neighbors joked that Eleanor simply wanted attention. Others believed she had made a mistake. But Eleanor knew exactly what she was doing. The house wasn't really for sale. The sign was bait. And the woman who placed it there was fishing for someone very specific. Weeks passed. Then months. Nothing. Just curious neighbors asking questions. But one afternoon, the phone rang. A man introduced himself as Daniel Mercer. His voice was calm. Confident. He said he had seen the listing. And despite the price, he was interested in taking a look. Eleanor agreed immediately. She scheduled the viewing for the following Saturday. When she hung up the phone, her hands trembled. Because something about his voice felt strangely familiar. But voices change over 10 years. Faces change. Hair turns gray. Weight shifts. Time erases details. So Eleanor waited. Saturday afternoon arrived quietly. The neighborhood was calm. Birds moved between tree branches. A distant lawnmower hummed somewhere down the street. At exactly 2:15 p.m., a dark sedan pulled into the driveway. The man stepped out. Mid-40s. Well-dressed. Confident. And when Eleanor opened the door, their eyes met. For a brief moment, time folded in on itself. Because she knew that face. Older. Softer. But unmistakable. It was the man who had visited the house 10 years earlier. The man who had studied the doors. The windows. The layout. The man who had looked back at the house. One last time. And Eleanor felt something cold settle into her chest. Because the trap she had imagined for 10 years might finally be closing. Daniel Mercer walked slowly through the house. Room by room. Asking polite questions. Complimenting the architecture. Examining the floors. But Eleanor noticed something else. He wasn't just looking. He was remembering. His eyes moved through the living room. Pausing briefly near the exact spot where Richard Whitmore had died. That was when Eleanor was certain. She smiled politely. Then said something simple. "Would you like some lemonade?" He nodded. Moments later, they sat at the kitchen table. 2 glasses between them. Cold. Fresh. Golden in the afternoon sunlight. Daniel took a long sip. Then another. And slowly, his expression changed. His fingers tightened around the glass. His vision blurred. And he looked up at Eleanor. Confused. She didn't smile anymore. "What did you do?" he asked weakly. Eleanor's voice was calm. "I've been waiting 10 years to meet you again." Daniel tried to stand. But the room tilted around him. His legs collapsed beneath the table. His breathing quickened. "You poisoned me." Eleanor shook her head slowly. "No. Just something to help you relax." She leaned forward. Looking directly into his eyes. "You came here once before. 3 days before my husband died." The silence that followed was heavy. Daniel said nothing. But the panic in his face said everything. And then, something unexpected happened. He began talking. Fast. Desperate. The words poured out. How he had planned the robbery. How Richard surprised him. How things got out of control. And how he ran, believing no one had ever seen him. A few minutes later, sirens echoed down Maplewood Lane. Police cars pulled into the driveway. Daniel Mercer was arrested on the kitchen floor. Still dizzy. Still shocked. Still talking. The cold case that haunted the town for 10 years was suddenly solved. News spread quickly. The neighborhood gathered outside. Everyone believed Eleanor Whitmore had finally achieved justice. But the real truth of what happened inside that house was far more complicated. Later that night, detectives asked Eleanor a simple question. How did you know it was him? She looked at them quietly. Then said something that stunned everyone in the room. I didn't. Because Daniel Mercer wasn't the man she remembered. Not exactly. The visitor from 10 years ago had looked similar. But Eleanor had never been completely certain. The truth was far more unsettling. The lemonade hadn't been meant for him specifically. Eleanor had spent the last 10 years inviting dozens of strangers to view the house. Every one of them offered the same glass of lemonade. Every one of them watched carefully. Every one of them questioned gently. Waiting. Testing. Hoping one day someone would reveal the truth. Daniel Mercer just happened to be the first one who did. But that wasn't the most disturbing part. Because when investigators later reviewed the recordings Eleanor secretly made during the visits, they discovered something else. Another man. 3 years earlier. A visitor who had reacted nervously to the lemonade. Who had left the house suddenly. Who had refused to answer questions. A man whose name was never recorded. Which meant one possibility still remained. Daniel Mercer might not have been the only one involved. And somewhere out there, a man may still remember the day he visited that house. And chose not to drink the lemonade. Now here's the question. Was Daniel Mercer the killer, or did the Real one walk away years ago? Tell me what you think in the comments. And if you enjoy stories like this, subscribe. Because the next case might be even stranger.